her family and the families of those who were also killed in the accident. I have known Congresswoman Walorski for years. I went to Notre Dame, the University of Notre Dame, out in South Bend, Indiana, that northern Indiana area she represents. Just a tragedy. But let's turn to Kansas, to the news of the day here beyond this terrible episode in Indiana. Sarah, what exactly happened in Kansas? It took the political world by surprise. You track abortion politics, abortion rights. Were you surprised?
You know, there was questions about where this would go. Kansas is a slightly unique state. But yes, I was surprised by the surge in turnout in opposition in Kansas. What we do know is that those who oppose this amendment, a coalition, really were on the ground knocking on thousands of doors, making hundreds of thousands of phone calls. And the goal here was to educate voters on the ground in the state, and they really went after a very diverse coalition of voters, and they were trying to focus on this as an issue, specifically just focusing on taking away the constitutional right to an abortion, and not looking at this through a partisan lens. So when they went and they did this, they were reaching out to moderate Republican voters in the suburbs. What we know about Kansas is there is a large advantage among registered Republicans in the state. There's about 850,000 registered Republicans, only about 495,000 registered Democrats. Interestingly enough, there are more unaffiliated voters registered in the state than Democrats. There's about 560,000. So the other group that they really went after here were those unaffiliated voters, really trying to build this coalition that could defeat this amendment. And what we saw is turnout here was above what we've seen in any other primary in Kansas to date. What we know is it was closer to a general election, including passing midterm general election turnout in most cases, except for 2018. So people were really rallied up looking at this, and they were able to beat expectations, not just in the counties that President Biden won. He only won a few, but in counties that Donald Trump won, there was a lower turnout of those who were in support of the amendment looking at this.
Jeff, if you're watching this inside the White House as a reporter, but also your sources inside the Biden White House, and they see this isn't California, this isn't New York, this is ruby red Kansas, and you have now abortion on the ballot in a way it never really has been on the ballot in recent midterm elections. How does what happened last night change the president and vice president's approach to the last 95 or so days before the election?
Well, it absolutely solidifies their argument that the Roe v. Wade decision, the Dobbs decision, will energize Democrats and will energize women of both parties. And that could change the equation entirely for the midterm elections. The prevailing wisdom and polls have shown so far that Republicans are likely to take over the House. The Senate looks a little bit more positive for the Democrats. But in general, as we all know, historically, this midterm election is normally a rough one for the person who's in, or the party that's in power in the White House. So with this kind of a decision in a ruby red state, as you said, Bob, this has to be seen as a good sign for Democrats and for this White House for its chances of potentially holding on to one or both houses of Congress and not having the landslide victory for the opposition that they want to avoid.
But, Jeff, what do you think they do? So Vice President Harris has been out there talking about abortion rights for weeks now. Do they send her to red states, perhaps? Do they change how they put the president and vice president out there? Do they change the messaging a little bit? Are you hearing anything from your sources about how this could all play out?
I haven't heard anything about travel to red states, although this president has made an effort to go to states that weren't just blue states or weren't just states that supported him. What I do think is, particularly in the coming months, you'll see both of them, Vice President Harris and President Biden, going to the states where there are competitive races and talking about this issue and talking about it and making it one of their lead arguments for why voters should get out and elect Democrats. And you hear the president saying all the time, you know, he can't change the law himself. He can issue executive orders. He issued one today that is meant to help protect abortion rights, but he can't change the law. And what he needs in order to do that, and what the argument he keeps making is send lawmakers to Congress who will do that. So I don't have anything specific, Bob, in terms of a change in plan for specific states that they'll go into, but I think you'll hear them make this a really big part of their argument in the coming months.
But part of the argument, of course, is going to have to be on the economy. Siobhan, when you're talking to members of the House, members of the Senate, they're still waiting to see if the Democrats can get this bill through, the climate and tax legislation. The deal cut with Senate Democrats, Senator Manchin. There's still Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, the moderate Democrat who's out there mostly silent on how she'll handle this piece of legislation. Do you have any reporting on where she's leaning? Because this is probably crucial for the Democrats in the final stretch.
Kyrsten Sinema is crucial in the final stretch, and not on where she's leaning, but on some of the issues that are in play. There was chatter today that Kyrsten Sinema has a couple of asks for her vote. One of those is $5 billion for Arizona for climate resiliency. Essentially, there's a drought in Arizona, and her state would benefit from that money. Also, more lenient terms on this Democratic effort to make carried interest. This is when hedge funds or private equity gets a share of the profit and gets favorable capital gains tax treatment for that, getting more favorable terms for that, something less onerous than the harsh crackdown on that tax treatment that Democrats want. So those are the things she's asking for. On the other side of the equation, you have Republicans who are considered to be the Sinema whisperers. And our understanding is that they are talking to Kyrsten Sinema frequently, putting a little bit bug in her ear about why this would be bad for her state. And then, of course, beyond that, what we are hearing is that Kyrsten Sinema is not promising to go along at the end with what is known as a wraparound amendment. This is something that Chuck Schumer could tack on at the very end to avoid any changes that get made through the amendment process. And if that were to happen, it's not clear that Kyrsten Sinema would go along. So there's a lot of ground to cover between now and likely late Saturday or Sunday when this vote is set to happen.
Sarah, just to finish up quickly here, to build off what Jeff was saying on the White House and how it might possibly respond here, when you're talking to abortion rights groups across the country, those who are on the progressive side, but those who are also opposed to abortion rights, what's the state of play in the coming weeks as they adjust to Kansas? We see in polling, for example, that 73% of women say abortion will be an important issue in the upcoming midterms. So how does that play out politically?
You know, I think what this really is they're going to have to look at how they're specifically messaging on this issue. Keep in mind, Kansas voters went to the polls directly to vote on abortion rights. In many of these races across the country, there won't be a ballot initiative on the ballot specifically on abortion rights. They'll be voting about candidates. They'll be voting for candidates either for or against abortion. So it'll be very interesting to see specifically how this translates, how they view abortion, where they're standing on that issue, but also where they look at these candidates, whether that is something that fits into the narrative that they're looking at when there's also so many other issues specifically at play. So that is something to keep in mind as we move forward. Abortion will be on the ballot, of course, in some states as amendments. So there are places where this could be specifically a motivating issue for that. But moving forward, candidates are really going to have to both put out there where they stand and also try and define where their opponents stand.
Such a good point. You have to have it on the ballot sometimes to get those voters motivated enough to get out there. Sarah Ewell-Weiss, Jeff Mason, Siobhan Hughes, really appreciate you being here. Thank you. And as we discussed, Indiana Congresswoman Jackie Walorski tragically died in a car crash, which happened late Wednesday afternoon. The Republican is one of 4 people who died in the crash. Her district director, Zachary Potts, her communications director, Emma Thompson, were also in the vehicle during the crash. The driver of the other vehicle, a 56-year-old woman whose car reportedly veered into oncoming traffic, was also pronounced dead at the scene. An investigation in Indiana is ongoing. Republican Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy shared a statement from the Congresswoman's office with a heavy heart. In part, the statement said, quote, she had returned home now to be with her Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Please keep her family in your thoughts and prayers. Republican Congressman from Indiana, Jim Baird, is joining us to remember his late colleague. Congressman, really appreciate you taking the time. A sad day for the country when you lose a member of Congress and their aides, but particularly a sad day for the Indiana delegation. Tell us about Congresswoman Walorski.
Well, we certainly lost the state of Indiana, and America really lost a wonderful advocate for doing the appropriate thing. She used common sense to come up with solutions to represent her people from right there in Indiana. And she served on the Ways and Means Committee. It gives you some idea about the confidence that her colleagues had in her as well as the leadership. And so we're going to miss her tremendously. I know that she cared deeply about her staff. And so we want to make sure that we express our concern and hers as well about having lost 2 members of her staff.
No, that's such a good point, Congressman, about the staff. I mean, as someone who covers Capitol Hill, these lawmakers like yourself, their lives are intertwined at times with the staff, working so closely. Tell us about that dynamic as a member of Congress yourself, and what would you say to the families of those, not only of the Congresswoman, but of those of the aides?
We're just very sorry. It's sad news to get this kind of news, and we are concerned about the families that are also involved, their families. And you are correct. When you do the kind of work we do, it's very intense sometimes, and so you serve as a team, and the staff becomes intertwined with the members of Congress, and that's important to make sure that we get the message that people in our district want in the legislative process. So Jackie was very talented at that. She had a personality that was outgoing, so you wanted to be around her and with her. And I've sat with Jackie many times on the House floor, and you never was lacking in terms of other colleagues coming by and asking her guidance or advice about things that were happening. And so it was a pleasure to serve with her. I know my other Indiana delegates, Indiana colleagues also appreciated her straightforwardness and her honesty, and she served on the Ethics Committee as well. So that also gives you some feel about the kind of person she was.
My sense is politically that her district, that northern Indiana stretch, was long a swing district. You think about Tim Romer, the Democrat for years, and Joe Donnelly, the former Democratic senator, used to represent that area. But now the district, after redistricting in certain recent decades, has become much more Republican, and it's probably going to stay Republican. She's also been an ally of former President Trump. In many ways. She's been an ally of House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, frequently standing with McCarthy at news conferences. In terms of her political legacy in Indiana, in the Congress, how would you define it?
I would say she was a very conservative, professional individual that worked hard at making sure she understood the legislation that was being passed, making sure that it did not have any unintended consequences, and she would do whatever was necessary to make sure it took care of the people back in her district. Well, she cared about them a great deal, and she spent some time, for example, doing some work in Romania before she became a congresswoman. And so that gives you some additional insight into the kind of person that she was.
Have you talked to anyone else in the delegation or in the House about how members are going to handle this in the coming days and what's next?
Well, we're making those contacts now and sharing our concerns. And so we need to make sure that the families are taken care of, and then we'll deal with the rest of that later.
Congressman, really appreciate you being here and sharing your thoughts. Congressman Jim Baird, a Republican of Indiana. Thank you, sir.
you.
Claims of voter fraud before ballots were cast, reproductive rights, and retribution for former President Trump. We'll talk about the results of last night's primaries and see how both parties might define their messaging now ahead of the midterm elections. You're streaming Red and Blue.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
You ready? A generation of kids opens up on CBS Reports.
I just want to be like a regular kid.
Their world, their struggles, their voices.
What if I was white?
A lot of people like to call names and make you feel ashamed for being proud of who you are.
Now streaming Gender.
I did not realize that you could change your gender.
Realizing how you feel.
You can be a boy, sometimes you feel like a girl, sometimes you feel like both.
Redefining who you are.
Identify as trans.
Gender fluid.
Non-binary and queer.
Is the idea of gender a thing of the
And
past?
to be yourself, always, no matter what anyone says, I love you.
Are the kids all right? Gender. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
Want to go someplace new? Yeah, you do.
See something new.
Learn something new.
Meet someone new. Nate B in the house.
There's always something new under the sun.
CBS Mornings, weekdays.
When weather is about to get extreme,
We're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging winds.
every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness. We found it.
You're kidding me!
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform, inspire, and brighten your day.
I've been waiting patiently for something like this.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream on the free CBS News app Tuesday mornings.
The results are in for many primary races held in 5 states yesterday, and it was a big night for candidates backed by former President Donald Trump. Trump-backed candidate Blake Masters won the Senate Republican primary in Arizona. He will now go up against incumbent Democratic Senator Mark Kelly in November. Also in Arizona, Mark Finchem won the Republican primary for Secretary of State. He has repeated false claims about the 2020 election and was backed by former President Trump. And in the Missouri Republican Senate primary, the state's Attorney General Eric Schmitt beat out former Governor Eric Greitens. The former president caused a bit of confusion on Monday after he endorsed, quote, Eric, without specifying which candidate he was endorsing. Mr. Trump did call Schmitt to congratulate him on Tuesday. For more on all of this and the Erics, Chuck Rocha and Emily Jasinski joined us now. Chuck is the president of Solidarity Strategies, and Emily is the culture editor for The Federalist and a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Forum. Great to have you both with us this evening. We appreciate your time. Chuck, we'll begin with you. Arizona's Senate race now could be won of the more competitive contest this year. How do you see Senator Mark Kelly's race with Republican Blake Masters?
Well, normally in Arizona, in an off-year election, and for all of you at home, off-year election is when the president's not on the ballot. And in these red states like Arizona and Georgia, it's normally tougher for a Democrat to win in an off-year election. But the Republicans have handed the Democrats lots of free gifts with some of the nominees that are backed by Trump that have been nominated in these states. You couple that with strong Democratic incumbents who've had strong fundraising, who have millions of dollars, who have already been advertising. Mark Kelly and his supported super PACs and the party apparatus have been advertising in English and, most importantly, in Spanish now for over 4 months. And I think this is going to make Arizona a real pivotal state when you look at it differently than you normally do in a regular off-year election.
You've worked, Chuck, with Latino voters for years. I remember covering you when you were working with Senator Bernie Sanders. How is that vote going to play out in Arizona? We have seen some trends across the country in various polls that it is moving to the right in some parts of this country.
It's interesting that you bring that up, Bob. And in Arizona, it hasn't moved to the right like it has in other states. In Arizona and in California, you haven't seen the drift to the right with Latino voters. But to your point, it's the most critical piece of this election. I go back to my original point. Those drop-off voters, guess who the majority of them are? Latino voters. The average age of a Latino voter in the U.S. is just 27. So they underperform more so black voters or white voters in an off-year election. So the key to Mark Kelly's success are these Latino voters who normally only participate every 4 years when the president's on the ballot. I think that's why you've seen the real intentionality of his campaign, doing lots of Spanish language advertising and organizing on the ground in the Latino community.
Emily, what's your take on Missouri's Senate race? The former Missouri governor, Eric Greitens, was unable to overcome scandals from his past in his bid for the Senate. The former president, as we've discussed and the media has discussed at length, endorsed Eric. What does Eric Schmidt, the attorney general's race, now look like in the general election?
Well, and Arizona is almost either a complement or a foil to what we saw happen in Missouri, because on the one hand, in Arizona, as Chuck said, it's become a really interesting test case for how some narratives might play out in general elections in the midterm and then also in primaries in 2024. And what you see there with Kari Lake or in the race we're just talking about with Blake Masters, you have some candidates that are, I guess, more persuasive embodiments of the post-Trump Republican Party or the post-2016 Republican Party. And you almost see that as well in Missouri in the race between the Erics, between Greitens and Schmidt. Greitens tried really hard to out-MAGA everyone. And in a lot of ways, you can look at Greitens as a very Trumpian candidate. But with him now losing, which was terrified a lot of Republicans here in Washington, D.C., you see a lane opening up for someone who could try at least to be an embodiment of the post-2016 Republican Party without what a lot of people see as the baggage that comes with some of the candidates in Arizona are a really good example of that.
What do you make, Emily, of when you see what happened in Kansas and when you're talking to sources on the conservative side of the Republican Party? Does this make them sit up a little bit and say they need to rethink their whole midterm strategy or not?
There's such a pronounced divide in the GOP over whether this issue is a political harm or a political advantage. And certainly it depends on the state and it depends on the region. The pro-life movement, part of the conservative movement, is convinced that this is politically expedient. To campaign on a strong pro-life ticket is something that helps Republicans. Kansas is something that gave the more establishment Republicans, maybe some folks over at the RNC, the opportunity to hold something up and say, listen, we are not going back to the 2012 war on women narrative because it is toxic in purple states and even in red states like Kansas. Now, Kansas is kind of an interesting state, but generally a red state. And so this gave a lot of sort of ideological ammunition to that establishment wing. And there has been that tug of war playing out in the Republican Party itself, behind closed doors, in Washington, D.C., and on campaigns around the country. How is this issue going to play out? Kansas is a big talking point for the people who think that it's going to lead to another war on women 2012 sort of redux.
And what about your take, Chuck, on what's happening with abortion and how it's going to affect Democrats?
The biggest problem that Democrats have in an off-year election is motivation, is excitement. And up until the decision by the Supreme Court, me and you and lots of us who've been talking about this in the party, Joe Biden's numbers are low. The Senate and the House numbers are higher than him, are overperforming him by 10 points. We passed all this legislation to change all these people's lives for the better, but couldn't get any traction on motivating our party and those drop off again midterm voters. This gives us an example and something to focus on that does energize, especially women in our party, especially sometimes, to Emily's point, moderate Republican women in certain states. And it gives us a lot of ammunition to run against Republicans on a very divisive issue. Early on with this issue, I was saying that if you really cared about this issue, you had picked a team red or team blue. But last night in Kansas proved me wrong, that there is a whole nother level of energy out there that Democrats need in a midterm election if we have any hopes of retaining the House or the Senate for our party's majority.
Emily, finally here, there's one other variable I'm tracking, which is the possible entry of former President Trump into the 2024 presidential race before November's elections. Are you hearing anything new on that? And if he got in, what do you believe the Republican response would be?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question because I do expect him to announce. Honestly, I expect him to announce in the fall, just based on what I've heard, because I think what he wants to do is establish his lane and, to just deter anybody else from thinking that they should be making those trips to Iowa or New Hampshire and trying to fundraise, talk to donors. Trump kind of wants to make clear, from my perspective, that this is his race. And so I would expect an announcement fairly soon because, basically we've already seen him announce it multiple times. And just from what he's told other people we know firsthand, that he's made it pretty clear that he's going to run. Could he still decide not to run? Certainly. But when you're this clear in public about it over and over again, I think it's a pretty strong indication of what I think a lot of reporters are also hearing in private, that an announcement should be expected soon, just to sort of clear the field in a way that might remind people of what happened with Hillary Clinton in 2016, when you had a pretty obvious favorite who really tried to consolidate and consolidate power, consolidate support. And I would expect maybe a few other candidates in the way that you had your Martin O'Malley's. I would expect to see something like a Republican version of that going into 2024.
I don't know if any Republican who's looking at 2024 wants to be compared to former Governor O'Malley's 2016 campaign, with respect to Governor O'Malley, but it didn't turn out too well.
Sure.
Chuck Rocha and Emily Jasinski, thank you very much to both of you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
New York Democratic Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney says she does not believe President Biden will run for re-election in 2024. Maloney, along with her Democratic primary challengers, were all asked if Mr. Biden should run for a second term during a debate on Tuesday. Remember, redistricting has forced Maloney to face off against Congressman Jerry Nadler, among others, in New York's 12th congressional district. Nadler said it's, quote, too early to say if the president should run again. The president and the White House have said multiple times that President Biden will seek re-election. And former President Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, is unlikely to face federal charges in an investigation of his lobbying activities. The FBI and the Manhattan District Attorney's Office have been looking into whether Giuliani illegally lobbied the Trump administration during the 2020 presidential race and got help from Ukrainian officials in that process. Giuliani's seized electronic devices reportedly did not contain any major red flags. Those devices have since been returned, and the federal investigation has not been officially closed. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan is raising new questions about the broader U.S. relationship with China. We talked with a former Undersecretary of State about what that visit means for U.S. foreign policy now and in the future. You're streaming CBS News.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
You ready? A generation of kids opens up on CBS Reports.
I just want to be like a regular kid.
Their world, their struggles, their voices.
What if I was white?
A lot of people like to call names and make you feel ashamed for being proud of who you are.
Now streaming Gender.
I did not realize that you could change your gender.
Realizing how you feel.
You can be a boy, sometimes you feel like a girl, sometimes you feel like both.
Redefining who you are.
Identify as trans.
Gender fluid.
Non-binary and queer.
Is the idea of gender a thing of the past?
And to be yourself, always, no matter what anyone says, I love you.
Are the kids all right? Gender. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
Want to go someplace new? Yeah, you do.
See something new.
Learn something new.
Meet someone new. Nate B in the house.
There's always something new under the sun.
CBS Mornings, weekdays.
When weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging winds.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
We found it.
You're kidding me!
We got it.
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform, inspire, and brighten your day.
I've been waiting patiently for something like this.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream on the free CBS News app Tuesday mornings.
Welcome back to Red and Blue. I'm Robert Costa. Here's a look at some of our top stories. Republican Representative Jackie Walorski was killed in a head-on collision in Indiana this afternoon. The Congresswoman's district director and communications director were also killed. President Biden signed a second executive order today aimed at protecting abortion access. The order seeks to protect patients traveling to states where abortion is legal. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi wrapped up a trip to Taiwan today. The visit has increased tensions between the U.S. and China and prompted threats of retaliation from Beijing. Natalie Brand has more from Capitol Hill.
Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, speaking alongside Taiwan's president, said America's determination to preserve democracy in Taiwan and beyond remains ironclad.
We want Taiwan to always have freedom with security, and we're not backing away from that.
The speaker, who made the trip despite threats of retaliation from China, received a warm welcome from President Tsai Ing-wen.
The speaker's presence here in Taiwan serves to boost public confidence in the strength of our democracy.
China's foreign minister called the speaker's visit a, quote, farce and said the U.S. is infringing on China's sovereignty. Speaker Pelosi and the Biden administration have stressed that the trip does not contradict long-standing U.S. policy towards Taiwan and China.
We have long said no change to the one China policy, and we've long said that we don't support Taiwan independence and that we're going to continue to support Taiwan's self-defense. And her visit there, while I know that drew the ire of Beijing, her visit there was completely consistent with all of that.
But as a result of the visit, China launched military exercises around the island, Beijing calling it a deterrent to separatist forces in Taiwan.
We urge the Chinese to look for opportunities to de-escalate the tensions and to keep the lines of communication open.
But the Biden administration says the U.S. expects China to continue to react economically and with more military drills, even though Speaker Pelosi has now left Taiwan. Natalie Brand, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
For more on Speaker Pelosi's trip to Taiwan and the ramifications of that trip, we're joined by former Undersecretary of State Keith Krach. He is also the chair of the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue. Good to have you here, sir. Let's begin with the news. What's the geopolitical fallout of the speaker's visit?
Well, Bob, I can tell you what, this trip that Speaker Pelosi made is really important. I support it. It's really great to see. It's heartening to see that it got bipartisan support with Mitch McConnell and 25 other Republicans. And it's an important message that she sends to Taiwan, that we're here for our friends. It's important for the world. And I really agree with the late Senator Vandenberg, where he said, you know, partisan politics ends at the water's edge, and especially the Taiwan Strait. So, and you know, I had that experience of being the highest-ranking State Department official to go to Taiwan. I got bipartisan support, and there's nothing that she fears more than a united United States.
Just briefly, to help our audience understand your background, which administration did you work in?
So I worked in the last administration. I ran economic diplomacy. I was Undersecretary of State. Before that, really a lifelong businessman. My last role was I was CEO and chairman of DocuSign.
So as an official from the Trump administration, you support the speaker wholeheartedly here in taking this kind of line on China, on Taiwan. But what is the risk, and what do we expect China to potentially do in the coming weeks, in months, in response to what's happened?
Well, I can tell you one thing. Nobody wants war. And Xi keeps moving the goalpost. You know, with his invasion, sending the security forces and co-opting Hong Kong and eviscerating its citizens' freedoms. And, you know, all you need to do is look at what's gone on in the Ukraine. And so what China, the only thing China understands is you've got to come from a source of strength. So I wholeheartedly support Speaker Pelosi because, you know, these guys are amping up their aggression. It's multi-dimensional warfare. It's a game of diplomatic, economic, military, and cultural chess. And at crossroads is technology. That's where the maiden battleground is.
But do you see the perspective of critics of this trip who believe it was too high risk?
You know, I see that. But what's the alternative? Allow China to dictate where American citizens go, let alone the Speaker of the House. So, yes, of course, she could go. And you know, one of the things that I'm seeing out there in corporate America is corporate America has woken up. I think they're tired of this bullying, intellectual property theft, subsidies, all those kind of things. And the most prominent board members are saying to their CEOs, they're demanding a China contingency plan because they know if there is that conflict, you know, in the Russian conflict, you know, hundreds of millions. This is 10 times. This is 10 times bigger. And they also know that when, you know, the dreaded becomes the inevitable, it's time to develop a plan and execute on it.
What's the economic risk here in some ways? You're a former businessman, longtime businessman. Suppose the Chinese decide to stop buying American debt.
Well, by the way, we've got much more leverage on them. We have a lot of tools in our pocket. And I think one of the things that you're seeing why Xi is coming across so aggressive is because of that Congress coming up in October. Now, he's, 99.9% chance he's going to get reelected as dictator for life. But he wants to pass his agenda. And, if you think of it, we've all had experience with bullies. And, why is a bully a bully? Typically, they're insecure. And, when you confront a bully, they back down. And they really back down if you have your friends by your side.
And any quick thoughts on the state of play in the South China Sea in terms of the U.S. military and Chinese military eyeing each other and tracking each other's movements?
Yeah, I think this is a very cautious time. And, and it doesn't need to be this way at all. I think, this is Xi pounding his chest. And we've got some great military leaders. And they're understanding, this situation. And what China has been doing, it's kind of slowly boiling that, that frog really in all those dimensions in terms of building islands and their war games. And Speaker Pelosi's trip to Taiwan is a perfect example of that. They're flying these warplanes. And when I went over to Taiwan, for President Lee's funeral, they flew 40 fighters and bombers across the median line. And, what was the purpose of that?
We'll have to leave it there. Keith Kroc, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Bob.
The Senate passed the PACT Act 86-11 in a vote last night after 25 Republican senators voted against it last week. The bill is meant to expand access for VA health and disability benefits for millions of veterans, including those exposed to toxic burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan. Veteran groups and advocates continued with a vigil at the Capitol this week. Jon Stewart, the former Daily Show host, was a vocal advocate in getting the legislation passed. The bill now heads to President Biden's desk to be signed into law on Monday. Another Republican who voted for the impeachment of former President Trump has been defeated in a primary election. We take you to Michigan for more on who beat the incumbent Congressman Peter Meijer and more about the takeaways from a busy primary night. You're streaming Red and Blue.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
You ready?
A generation of kids opens up on CBS Reports.
I just want to be like a regular kid.
Their world, their struggles, their voices.
What if I was white?
A lot of people like to call names and make you feel ashamed for being proud of who you are.
Now streaming Gender.
I did not realize that you could change your gender.
Realizing how you feel.
You can be a boy, sometimes you feel like a girl, sometimes you feel like both.
Redefining who you are.
Identify as trans.
Gender fluid.
Non-binary and queer.
Is the idea of gender a thing of the past?
And to be yourself, always, no matter what anyone says, I love you.
Are the kids all right? Gender, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
Want to go someplace new? Yeah, you do.
See something new.
Learn something new.
Meet someone new. Nate B in the house.
There's always something new under the sun.
CBS Mornings, weekdays.
when weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail. We're talking about tornadoes, damaging winds.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
We found it.
You're kidding me!
We got it.
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform, inspire, and brighten your day.
I've been waiting patiently for something like this.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream on the free CBS News app Tuesday mornings.
Republican Congressman Peter Meijer has narrowly lost his primary race to Trump-endorsed candidate John Gibbs. Meijer is now the second Republican who voted to impeach the former president and lost his re-election bid. Joining us now is Jonathan Osteen. He is a state government and politics reporter for Bridge, Michigan. Jonathan, appreciate you being here. Was Congressman Meijer's vote to impeach the former president ultimately what sank him in this race?
Well, I think it obviously had a large role. I mean, it was one of his very first votes. As a congressman, he was a freshman U.S. rep when the riots occurred at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. He voted to impeach Trump shortly thereafter. And of course, that made him a huge target of the former president. Peter Meijer is sort of the last man standing in the Michigan GOP delegation anyways. U.S. Rep. Fred Upton, who joined Meijer in impeaching Trump over January 6th, retired instead of seeking re-election. So Trump was able to focus a lot of his ire on Meijer here in Michigan and played a key role in helping John Gibbs win this race.
What do Democrats think of John Gibbs' chances of holding this seat in the general election?
Well, Democrats are actually pretty optimistic. They ran we've seen this across the country. They ran these sort of soft attack ads against Gibbs that actually kind of boosted him in the GOP primary by reinforcing his support from Donald Trump. So they obviously saw him as the more beatable candidate in a general election. This district is centered around Grand Rapids, which has been growing more liberal already. And now through a redistricting process with the state's new independent redistricting commission, legitimately does give Democrats a much better shot of flipping this seat. They've got a candidate, Hillary Scholten, who also ran 2 years ago and proved a pretty capable fundraiser. So Democrats are pretty optimistic heading into the general.
I'm fascinated by this dynamic of Democrats spending money in a Republican primary to elect a Trump-aligned Republican because they believe that Trump-aligned Republican would be an easier opponent in a general election. When you're talking to Democrats in the district and in Michigan, is there any kind of nuance or complication to this whole scenario playing out? Are they recognizing in any way, privately or publicly, that this could have a cost down the line in terms of not only politics, but American democracy?
Certainly. I mean, especially, sort of the consultant class here in the political world in Michigan, has told me there's genuine fears that this could backfire. Of course, a lot of folks thought Trump would be the more beatable candidate in 2016 as well, and, may have tacitly supported him in some way, thinking he would pave the way to a Hillary Clinton election. We all saw how that turned out. So Peter Meijer really spoke out against this. Of course, he said he was fed up with Democrats, talking about being pro-democracy and then spending to essentially help take down one of the few Republicans who voted to uphold the, peaceful transition of power by holding Trump accountable for January 6th.
Beyond this district, Michigan is at times almost feels like the center of the political world in this country. It's a swing state in the sense that you have a Democratic governor who's high profile, but the Trump movement is still very visible there in parts of the state. And before election night, Michigan's Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, a Democrat, said she would crack down on threats of violence. Let's listen.
I am here to assure voters that they will be safe and that their rights will be protected. We will not tolerate any attempts to disrupt our elections, any voter suppression or election interference attempts in Michigan.
Meanwhile, Michigan Republicans canceled a watch party due to a threat. What exactly is going on in Michigan based on your reporting in terms of violence or the threat of violence in American politics?
Well, the good news in Tuesday's primary election was that there was no, notable instances or threats of violence at polling places around the state. But Secretary of State Benson has been working on this issue for a couple years. She tried to ban open carry guns at polling places 2 years ago, but her directive was overturned by the courts. In the last, in this cycle, we have seen at least a couple Republicans talk about essentially needing to stand up and fight if they thought this election was not fair. One state Senate candidate, Mike Detmer, in fact, suggested that voters might want to show up armed to protect poll challengers. And we know that the Republican parties, went to great lengths to recruit and train new poll challengers and election inspectors to try and supervise this election more closely. Now, as I mentioned, those concerns didn't really bear out on Tuesday, aside from one poll challenger that I know of in Detroit being removed from the absentee counting board for alleged harassment. There really weren't many issues across the state.
Jonathan, really appreciate getting your granular sense of things from Michigan. Hope you can come back soon. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back. You're streaming Red and Blue on CBS News.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
You ready? A generation of kids opens up on CBS Reports.
I just want to be like a regular kid.
Their world, their struggles, their voices.
What if I was white?
A lot of people like to call names and make you feel ashamed for being proud of who you are.
Now streaming Gender.
I did not realize that you could change your gender.
Realizing how you feel.
You can be a boy, sometimes you feel like a girl, sometimes you feel like both.
Redefining who you are.
Identify as trans.
Gender fluid.
Non-binary and queer.
Is the idea of gender a thing of the past?
And to be yourself, always, no matter what anyone says, I love you.
Are the kids all right? Gender. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
Want to go someplace new? Yeah, you do.
See something new.
Learn something new.
Meet someone new. Nate B in the house.
There's always something new under the sun.
CBS Mornings, weekdays.
When weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail. We're talking about tornadoes, damaging winds.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
We found it.
You're kidding me?
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform, inspire, and brighten your day.
I've been waiting patiently for something like this.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream on the free CBS News app Tuesday mornings.
NASA has released stunning new images captured by the James Webb Telescope, this time of the Cartwheel Galaxy. The pictures are the clearest look yet at the faraway galaxy, which is named after its wagon wheel resemblance. The galaxy is about 500 light-years away in the Sculptor constellation. Two smaller companion galaxies are also visible in the telescope's incredible captures. And that does it for today. You can stream Red and Blue Monday to Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. And a reminder, if you want to watch previous episodes of this program, you can see them anytime on the CBS News website. Just head to cbsnews.com/redandblue.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
When weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging wind.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history. You know him as a comedian, but he's using his celebrity as a force for change.
People think veterans get health care for life. They don't.
We go person to person with Jon Stewart.
Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lana Zach. Thanks so much for joining us. Here's a look at the top stories we're following right now. Kansas votes to protect abortion rights, how clinics in the conservative state are preparing, and which other states will soon have the issue of abortion on their ballots as well. President Biden takes action to protect abortion access, what his executive order entails, and what limitations remain. And a congresswoman and 3 others are killed after a car crash in Indiana. We have new details on the accident. And then later this hour, conspiracy theorist Alex Jones walks back his claims that the Sandy Hook massacre was fake. We'll have the latest on his defamation trial, including a possible mistake from his legal team involving text messages. Plus, monkeypox cases are rising in the country, but getting a vaccine remains a challenge. Why a group of senators wants the president to invoke the Defense Production Act. But first, President Biden has signed an executive order on abortion rights 1 day after voters in Kansas rejected a ballot measure that would have eliminated constitutional protections for the procedure. Kansas is a conservative state and was the first to put the issue of abortion on the primary ballot following the reversal of Roe v. Wade. The decision led to mass voter turnout, and Caitlin Huey-Burns has more from Overland Park, Kansas.
In conservative Kansas, an unlikely victory for abortion rights.
I'm super proud to be from Kansas tonight.
Voters rejected a measure that would have removed abortion protections from the state constitution, which would have paved the way for the Republican legislature to enact further restrictions.
What was at stake was our constitutional rights and our freedom.
Anti-abortion rights groups say this is just a setback.
Our resolve has never been stronger than in this very moment.
The results